Okay, so the question really that deserves to be asked is, in the Chumash, it mentions the Daled Minim first. The first it mentions the 4 species. And afterwards, it mentions Sukkah, dwelling inside the hut, the Sukkah. In the Gemara, it talks first about the Sukkah, and then it talks about the Daled Minim. So why is there a change in the order of these laws? And that question I will let you think about, and we will have some answers over time. If you come up with an answer, you please feel free to share. But that is a question just in general. When you look back, step back and take a look at the whole tractate. Why is it in this order? That is one of the interesting discussions that is spoken about. So we're going to begin right now. Sukkah she gavaya l'mayla mi'esrei amma, a sukkah that is high above 20 amas. Dula is puzzle. It is not kosher. Now, the meaning of this is that the schach, which is the roof of the sukkah, is very high. It's above 20 amas. How much is 20 amas? 20 amas is a debate. In amma, there's a debate how big an amma is. It's anywhere between 18 inches or 24 inches, and there's different opinions also in between those two numbers, 18 inches or 24 inches, as the size of an amma. So approximately, we could say between 30 and 40 feet high. If the schach is between 30 and 40 feet high, you're entering into an area of question. And if it's above 40 feet, then it's definitely puzzle, according to the Tanakama, the first opinion. So the Mishnah says that it's puzzle, psula. And then the Mishnah says, Rebbe Yehuda machshir. Let me mute everyone. Rebbe Yehuda machshir, Rebbe Yehuda permits it. He called it kosher. Machshir is from the word kosher. And so there is a debate here in the Mishnah between the Tanakama, the first opinion, and Rebbe Yehuda, this second view. If the sukkah that is very high, which is above 20 amas, which we said is somewhere between 30 and 40 feet, if it's above that, then there's a debate if it's kosher. The first opinion in the Mishnah says psula, it's puzzle. The second opinion in the Mishnah is Rebbe Yehuda, he says it's kosher. So this really would apply if a person wanted to have a nice big sukkah with a high ceiling. It's very, very nice. People like to have a high ceiling, but that could be a reason why the sukkah would be puzzled. The Gemara is going to go through reasons why that should be. Why should a sukkah be puzzled just because the schach is so high? What would the reason be? Why would that ruin things? Just because you have a high ceiling? Is there something wrong with a high ceiling in Judaism? Why is a sukkah puzzle for having a high ceiling, according to the Tanakama? Again, Rabbi Yehuda says it's kosher, but the first opinion says it's puzzle. So the Gemara is going to go through a few different reasons, logic, why that should be puzzle. Yes, Yosef, did you want to ask a question? You're muted, so you have to unmute you. Okay, fine. Now, the Mishnah continues, and it gives other examples.
Rabbi.
Yes.
I'm not sure what Yosef's background is. He might not understand the word puzzle.
Excuse me? Okay.
Invalid.
Thank you, David. Yeah, puzzle means invalid. So there's the opinion of Amma is that a sukkah that's above 20 amas, around 40 feet, is puzzle. It's invalid. But Yehuda permits it. He says it's kosher. Now we're on line 2 over here. If the sukkah is not high 10 tfachim, that means it's very, very low. So here's the opposite extreme. Or v'she'ein la shalosh stefanos, it doesn't have 3 walls. V'shechamsa meruba mitzilasa, or if the chama, the sun, or the sunlight, is meruba, is more mitzilasa than the shade, psula, it's invalid. So there are 3 more cases where a person could invalidate their sukkah. One is if it's too low. One is if it doesn't have 3 walls. Now, we know that the sukkah, there are numerous laws about how the walls of a sukkah have to be. And there are leniencies that a sukkah does not need to have 4 walls. Many sukkahs are made with 3 walls, but it does need at least 3 walls. Now, we're going to find out that even the 3rd wall doesn't have to be a full wall, but it has to be a partial wall. But there needs to be 3 walls. And it needs to have sail. It needs to have shade. That's the goal of the sukkah. The meaning of the word sukkah is...
Spell out the word sukkah. And you see all the kosher shapes of a sukkah. Samach is 4 walls. Chaf is 3 walls, and Hey is 2 walls with a little tail. And each of those are valid shapes for a sukkah.
Thank you, Isaac. Yes, that is such a vart. It doesn't really go so well here where it spells sukkah with a vav, but it's a
Look,
vart.
they spell it wrong. It's my problem.
In the Chumash, sukkah is spelled without a vav, so... it's a very nice vart. I don't know who the source of that vart is. Maybe the Chida, I think. But anyway, very nice vart. That the sukkah, really, the word sukkah shows you the kosher options of a sukkah. But anyway, the point is that a sukkah is kosher with only 3 walls. And even when you say it's kosher with 3 walls, it doesn't have to be 3 full walls. Even we'll find out that the 3rd wall could be a partial wall, it's still going to be kosher. And the final case of the Mishnah was that it needs to have shade. And the shade of a sukkah, the Mishnah mentions that it has more sunlight than shade. It would be non-kosher, invalid. A sukkah needs to have the name of the word sukkah means shade, so it definitely needs to have schach that's going to cause that there will be shade, and it definitely won't have more sunlight than shade. Now, the Gemara, it jumps right in to comparing our Mishnah with another Mishnah that talks about heights. And the other Mishnah uses a different method, a different avenue, a different style. And the Gemara is bothered with why that Mishnah uses a certain style and our Mishnah uses a different style. And so the Gemara says as follows: Tanan Hasam, we learned a Mishnah over there means in Eruvin. Mavoi, a mavoi is a dead end. It's a street that it has one end that's closed, and the other end goes into a public fair, a thoroughfare, a regular street, a Rishus Harabim. But the dead end is basically used for the different communities or the chatzeros, different courtyards. Thank you. There are courtyards that houses are opened up to, and they open up into this mavoi, this dead end, this alley. And the law is that on Shabbos, according to the Torah, you should be allowed to carry from your house into the courtyard and into this dead end. The reason is because it's not a public area. In a public area, we know you're not allowed to carry on Shabbos. You can't take something and carry a dalet amos is prohibited biblically to carry. It's also prohibited to take something from your private domain into the public domain, even if you don't go dalet amos, even if you don't go 4 amos, but just taking it from one domain to another domain would be prohibited on Shabbos biblically. And the law is that carrying something while you're going from your house to the courtyard or to the dead end alley, there should be no problem. However, the rabbis made a decree. They said, we're afraid that person may make a mistake and compare this alley to a regular Rishus Harabim street. And because of that, we need you to make a hecker, some type of recognition that will clarify, that will make it clear that this is not a thoroughfare. This is not a regular Rishus Harabim, a real street, but this is really more like a private area. So we need to make a hecker. How do you make this hecker, this recognition, this mark that will show that this mavoi, this alley that's a dead end is not really similar to a public street, to a Rishus Harabim? So the way to do that is 2 options. One is that you could put a vertical pole at the entrance, and by putting the vertical pole, it will be symbolic. It'll make a sign that this is not similar to a public thoroughfare. Or the other option is to put a beam horizontally across, and that will, so to speak, close off this dead-end alley from being similar to a street, because it's really closed off on all 4 sides. You have 3 walls. You have 3, it's closed off on 3 ends. And the 4th side that really is connected to enters into the public domain is really closed off, because you have a pole going from one end to the other, a beam, either a pole a vertical or a beam horizontal. And the horizontal beam, it makes a symbol that this is not a public domain. And then you could make a shituf mavuos. Then you would, together with doing another ritual, you would be able to carry. You'd need to also do an official eruv, which includes having some food, wine, or bread, and doing what's called an eruv. But besides that, you need to have this beam across. Now, what happens if the beam across is very high? If the beam across is very high, so there's a Mishnah in Eruvin that says you need to lower it. And Rabbi Yehuda says you don't have to. Let's read it inside. Tanan Hassam, we learned over there, Mavoi, an alleyway that's closed on 3 ends and it's open to a public domain. So it's a dead end, but the entrance to it is a public domain. That's what a mavoi is. It's a mavoi shugavoya meyasrimama, that the beam that you put on as a symbol that this is not a public domain, that horizontal beam, you put very high up. It's gavoya meyasrimama. It's higher than 20 amos. It's more than 40 feet high. So the Mishnah says you got to lower it. Rabbi Yehuda says you do not need to. So the Gemara is bothered. Ma'ishna, why is it different? Gabe Sukkah, regarding Sukkah, the Tani Psula that we learned invalid. Ma'ishna Gabe Mavoi, the Tani Takanta. Why by Mavoi, the case of this alley, we learned a way of rectifying it. And why over there does it just say blunt? It's invalid by the law of Sukkah. Over here, I should say. Why over here in Sukkah it says bluntly invalid, and over there it says a way of rectifying it. It says you have to lower it. So the Gemara is bothered with this change of style in the Mishnah. You would think that if the Mishnahs give you advice, then our Mishnah in Sukkah should also give you advice. Lower it. Lower the schach. And if the Mishnah is meant to be more of a legal book that just says kosher and non-kosher, valid, invalid, then in Eruvin also it should say very clearly if it's valid or invalid. And over there it says a takana, it says a way of fixing it, and the term used over there is yema'et. Yema'et, lower the beam, the horizontal beam, which is called a kaira in Hebrew. The Hebrew word for that is the kaira. You have to lower the kaira, and therefore it'll be a proper eruv. So that's the question of the Gemara. What does the Gemara answer? So the Gemara says, Sukkah da'araisa, we're on line 5 over here. Sukkah da'araisa tani psula, because Sukkah is a law, biblical law. To make a Sukkah and to dwell inside the Sukkah, it's da'araisa, it's biblical. Tani psula, so we learn that it is puzzle. It says the law, that it is considered invalid. Mavoi d'Rabbanan, but a mavoi, this alley that really biblically you're allowed to carry. It's only a rabbinic law. A rabbinic law, you have to put up some type of symbol, either a lechi or a koira, either this vertical beam or horizontal beam. And so this is a rabbinic law that you have to kosher this domain to make it eligible to carry in for an eruv. And so mavoi is a law d'Rabbanan. This is a rabbinic law. So therefore, tani takanta, so we learn the Mishnah teaches a way of rectifying it by lowering it. Now, what does that mean? Just because something is biblical, you have to say the law, and something that's rabbinic, you can give advice. So
the people that made the halacha are telling you what you can do with the halacha. They're the ones who created it to begin with. So they're giving you the advice on how you can work with it. That's all. It's nothing getting around. They're not about to give you a takanta on a diaraisa, what you can do. It says this, if you do it, good. If you don't do it, no good. Rabbanan, we say you got to do this. If you have something that's higher or lower, we're telling you how you can fix it.
So what you're saying, Isaac, is very similar to Rashi. It's not exact, and I'll tell you why. Rashi explains. Rashi explains that when you say something is invalid, it's got to already be invalid. It sounds like it's already established that it's invalid. So when it comes to the rabbinic law of mavoi, it cannot say it's invalid. It can't use that term. Why not? Because it's not yet invalid. Right. It's now we are deciding to make it invalid. So you can't just say a mavoi, if it's above 20 amas, it's invalid, because that implies like it was that it's established to be invalid, and it's not established to be invalid. We're now deciding to make it invalid. In other words, the rabbis who made this law, the rabbinic authority of this law of mavoi, of the alleyway, that was established at that point when they learned this Mishnah. And therefore, the Mishnah can only say that we are now telling you what to do, kosher it, lower it, and if you don't, it will be invalid, basically. If you don't, it's going to be invalid, but not that it is established as a law that it's invalid. Sukkah, already established as laws, the law of Sukkah is in the Torah, and therefore it's already established to be, it learns psula because it's considered puzzle according to Torah law, as we'll see in the Gemara, reasons why it's considered invalid according to the Torah. And therefore, it can use the word psula, it can use the word puzzle. And so that is, the Mishnah can use the word puzzle. What did you say?
Yes, Rabbi. Can I ask a question?
Yeah, sure.
Yes. When you said it's psula, that means if we use the sukkah, we are making avera, or we are not making a mitzvah.
If the sukkah is too big, if the sukkah is too
If
tall,
it's psula,
high,
it's psula.
it's psula.
So
if it's too high.
we are making avera. If we use it,
Oh, if you use it, you don't fulfill sukkah. It's like you're eating inside your house.
okay, not mitzvah.
Oh.
We are not making a mitzvah. It's
But
nothing.
it's also an avera because it's a
It's avera.
yeah, because it's an obligation. Basukot teshvu
תשבו שבעת ימים.
yamim.
Yeah.
You're obligated to dwell in the sukkah for 7 days.
Yes.
And therefore, if you don't, it's a
It's avera. Okay.
avera.
I understand.
Yeah, there's an obligation to dwell in a sukkah. And
But in the end, we can have the measurement how high must be the schach.
so there's a limit. Now, there's an
limit.
argument in our Mishnah. According to one opinion, there's no limit. According to Rabbi Yehuda, there's no limit. But according to the Tanakama, according to the first opinion, there's a limit. It's 20 amos, which is between 30 and 40 feet. Now, there's also a limit. There's also a minimum of how a sukkah could be. And that we also saw in the Mishnah. So
Okay.
the laws of the Torah are very defined. In other words, every mitzvah has limits to it. And there's a reason for that every mitzvah there has to be limits to the mitzvahs, because the whole idea of mitzvahs are to elevate the world that we live in, and we live in a very finite world. And so all these limits of the mitzvot are part of the goal of doing the mitzvahs is to elevate the world, which includes the limitations of the world as well. So that is the limit of the sukkah. Now the Gemara now answered the question that we had about why the style is different in our Mishnah than in the Mishnah in Eruvin, and we compared the two laws. It's interesting that the law is the same there by Eruvin, about 20 amos, and we have the same opinions. We have a Tanakama and we have Reb Yehuda. Both of them seem to follow their same logic, that Reb Yehuda has no problem of having something very tall. And the first opinion, the Tanakama, the first view, holds that over 20 amos ruins things. And so anyway, the Mishnah explained that there's a difference between the style of a biblical law and the style of writing when it comes to a rabbinic law that we're establishing. Yes.
When you say Sukkah deoraita, it means halacha leMoshe miSinai, correct? Because it's not written there sizes. It just says that, for 7 days you have to sit in the sukkah. Nowhere does it say the sukkah has to be no higher than this, no lower than that,
right?
Etc. So when you say deoraita, you're talking about Moshe's giving this information to Bnei Israel, but it's not written in the Torah itself.
All right. So that's a very good question that you're asking. Does this mean a halacha l'Moshe miSinai, which was only given orally, or is this something that's hinted to in the psukim? As you're saying, it definitely doesn't say it clearly. 20 amos is the limit, because if it did, then Rabbi Yehuda would not be able to argue. But does the Gemara mean that it's a halacha l'Moshe miSinai, or is it simply mean that it was given at Sinai as part of the Torah, but it's not really a halacha l'Moshe miSinai? So the Gemara is going to give reasons why it has to be 20 amos, how we know it. So based on those reasons, it definitely seems that it's not learned as a halacha l'Moshe miSinai, because if it was a halacha l'Moshe miSinai, then the Gemara would just say it's a halacha l'Moshe miSinai. So seemingly it's based on the teachings that they're proving from, and they're proving from different psukim that it has to be there's a limit of 20 amos. So it doesn't seem like they're learning from it's a halacha l'Moshe Messina. Rashi uses the word that it's was taught. We learn mida araisa before the Mishnah was mentioned. It was said before the Mishnah was studied or was taught. It was said its measurement from Sinai, but I don't think that means a halacha l'Moshe Sinai. It would seem that is really just saying that it's part of the Torah. The back over here, I have commentary on Rashi. Let's see if they quote this Rashi. Sukkah midaraisa.
So,
It could be. It could be. There seems to be a little hint over here from the Maratz Chias.
from what I read of Rashi, it appears as if Hashem gave it to Moshe, and Moshe then transmitted it. But it's
Tell us Moshe Sinai.
The only question is how does he learn the Gemara afterwards? Because the Gemara brings psukim, which imply that it's
Right.
learned from these psukim, that it's not exactly a halacha l'Moshe Sinai in that style. In other words, maybe it was taught at Sinai because it's part of the halachas, but does it mean to say it's a halacha? Generally, the term halacha l'Moshe Sinai means that it's something that we don't have a psukim that teach. It's simply a tradition from Sinai that you can't really argue about. There's no.
But
And,
when you're using psukim, you're using there an asmachta. Doesn't mean that because since there's nothing written per se in the Torah, thing that you use.
Okay, so
is your support for your point of view.
let's see how the Gemara. Let's see if you're comfortable with that after you see the Gemara, because the Gemara brings a lot of halachas based on these reasons. So it seems that it might not be a asmachta. You sometimes find that it's an asmachta, but from the way the Gemara, the style of the Gemara, let's see how the Gemara continues, because you'll see that it doesn't seem that way from the Gemara. From the Gemara, it definitely seems that that these reasons are solid. Okay, is there another question? Yosef?
It still don't say the amos.
It's perfect.
By the Aron, it said 2.5 amos. By 1.5 amos, the Torah knows how to get into half a amos. And nowhere does it say in the Torah 20 amos. So therefore, 20 amos part of it has to be a halacha l'Moshe Sinai. I don't know what else you're going to call it.
Okay, so let's see the Gemara. Very good question. Let's see. So the Gemara now says, before your discussion is right after this. There's one more thing we have to say, and then we'll get right into that. The Ibayasema, if you want, you could say another reason why our Mishnah, the style of our Mishnah, is different than the style in the Mishnah in Eruvin. If you want, you could say as follows: B'daraisa nami tani takanto. Even biblical matters, you could give advice of how to rectify it. Mihu, however, sukkah, in the case of sukkah that we are learning now, dinafishi milsa, that it's many matters are being discussed, pasuk, pasuk, it made a psak, it made a rule, vatani psula, and it taught puzzle. Mavoy, however, the case, it taught that it's invalid. Mavoy, the case of the alley, delay nafish mile, that it doesn't have so many different cases, doesn't have so many literally words, but means cases. Tani takanta, it taught a way of rectifying it. What does this mean? Our Mishnah would be very confusing if it had to give you how to correct things, because the Mishnah talks about if it's too tall, then it talks about if it's too short, then it talks about if it doesn't have enough walls, and then it talks about if it has too much sun. If it had to if it taught you how to rectify it, it would make it unclear and complex. Here, it just tells you straight out, it's puzzle. Now you're gonna have to use your head. You're gonna have to figure out what you need to do. But if I include all the ways of corrections inside the Mishnah, it's gonna be too many different details in one shot. Better, I'm just gonna clarify it and say puzzle, it is invalid. And now we'll figure out each in your scenario how to correct it. And so the case of Mavoy and the case of and the laws of Eruvin, over there, it does not need to, in the case of Eruvin, it does not have so many cases. It's very simple. You're talking about one case, this Mavoy, this alley that's opened on one side to the public fair. And therefore, it just says how to correct it because it's very simple and it makes it very easy. So it's clear, and you could say the way of rectifying it. Our Mishnah would be too many details to do that, and that is the second answer that the Gemara gives. So the Gemara gave two answers to the question of the style of our Mishnah compared to the Mishnah in Eruvin. And now comes the big question of Menahani Mili. How do we know Menahani Mili? How do we know about this law that the sukkah, according to the Tanakama, cannot be more than 20 amos? So Menahani Mili, from where do we learn this law?
Rabbi, I don't believe that the Torah talks about a mavoy per se. But it does talk about a sukkah per se.
Correct.
So I think the initial part here, this is basically saying, okay, the Torah talks about a sukkah, so what is a sukkah? And so they're saying this is what it is not.
Okay.
Whereas a mavoy, because it's never discussed anywhere, in the Gemara, you have to explain everything.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the only thing is, over there, we're not really discussing what is a mavoy. The Mishnah is really telling you what you need to do to it, to kosher it for, in order to make it usable that you could carry. And sukkah is really what you do to the sukkah. It seems that, everyone knows what a hut is, but what needs to be done to it to make it a kosher hut. So here we say a law that a sukkah is not kosher if it's too high. And there we say a mavui is not able to be carried in unless you fix it, unless you do something. So in other words, both laws are seemingly, it's telling us a law about a certain scenario in a certain case, and it could really say either if it's valid or invalid, or it could say what you need to do to it to make it valid or not.
Rabbi?
So seemingly it's very similar.
Rabbi?
Let me just see if Ezra is satisfied with that. Does that answer your question, Ezra?
Well, to me, the reason why the beam is there is so that you can actually see it as a way of recognizing this is the end point. You can't go beyond this point, because if you do, then you're in the Reshut Rabim, and you have now been over a deoraita.
Mhm.
Okay?
Okay.
With the sukkah, again, the reason why you don't want it to be so high is because, again, you don't recognize that you are in a sukkah. So
Okay.
therefore, it has to be low enough that you recognize that there is chach and there is something that's providing you with shade. And so therefore you are in something that Hashem wants you to be in during this period of time.
Mhm.
I mean,
So one of the reasons of the Gemara fits somewhat with what you're saying. I'm not sure why you want to compare it to the Mavoi. In other words, are you going?
because sukkahs is daf, it's in the Torah. It's written. The word sukkah is written there,
True.
whereas mavoi is not. So
Okay.
you have to explain what a mavoi is before you can actually say, these are the delineations of what it is.
Okay.
Whereas
But
in sukkah, the word is there. The question is, what exactly is it? And so therefore, the way that's being taught over here is, this is what it cannot be.
Mhm. Mhm. So what question is your insight answering? In other words, the Gemara compared the laws and was bothered, so it gave an answer. You're comparing sukkah to this mavoi, and
Well, I'm
what
saying
are
that
you answering? That's what I'm just wondering what you're trying to say. In other words, yeah,
what I'm
there's
saying is
differences.
that for you to recognize in what space you're in, you have to have this limitation on the height.
Uh-huh.
And that's the
Okay, so
reason
you
why
like the idea of visibility. I'm sorry for cutting you off. You basically like this idea of being recognizable. So
it has to be recognizable. Otherwise,
same thing
people
as the
will make
mavoi.
mistakes.
And basically this, I don't know who's making noises. But basically the mavoi is the same thing you're saying probably also, because if it's a beam that is horizontal and it's too high up, so you don't see that, right? So you're basically saying it's very similar. The mavoi law and the sukkah law are very similar, that you need to be able to see it. Is that more or less what you're saying, that both of them really fit together?
Yeah, because most of the time
Okay.
we don't look up
Right.
for things. And so
Right.
therefore it has to be low enough so that it comes within eyesight.
Right. Right. So I like your answer very much. It's actually mentioned in the Gemara. The Gemara doesn't. I'm sorry about the noise.
Joseph has to mute himself.
I just muted him. Okay.
Okay.
So the thing is that the Gemara doesn't really compare. The Gemara doesn't really compare after this discussion. It doesn't compare it to Mavoi because that's dependent over there in the laws of Eruvin. It'll talk about the rules of Mavoi. But your answer is discussed here in the laws of Sukkah. I personally am impressed that you came up with that, because I would have thought, dwelling in the Sukkah, doesn't matter how high the roof is, but the fact that you're dwelling in this, in this tent, so who cares how tall the roof is? The tent, you're in a sukkah, but the Gemara says your reason. I'm just saying, it's interesting that you came up with that. I would have thought that.
Rabbi, I didn't come up with this. I've already learned Sukkah a couple of times, and I've already
okay.
and I've already learned Eruvin a couple of times. So it's
Oh, I see.
So don't give me more credit than necessary.
Okay, yeah. So that is one of the explanations. Okay, let's go into the Gemara. So the Gemara says,
Rabbi,
yeah, yes.
I just want to say the Mavai is that this could have taken place as a result of the structures of the buildings during the time of biblical times, Har Sinai, that the buildings were at a certain height during those times. Facing the sukkah was changed later at a different time, and that's why these laws came into effect to change what was happening at a later time. There was
So
more.
I'm not sure what you're referring to, but maybe we'll see later. Let's continue the Gemara. and maybe we'll talk about your thought another time. Maybe it'll come in. But I'm not sure what you mean about it. Other times we're going to see in the Gemara on page 11, it's going to talk about the it'll talk about the two types of sukkahs that we dwelled in. So that might be where what you're saying is connected to. But let's continue over here. So the Gemara has asked a question of what is the source? From where do we know this, that you can't have a sukkah more than 20 amos? And as we've heard from some of our participants, that the Torah definitely doesn't say the law of 20 amos. So where is it? Where do we get this from? So the Gemara says, Amar Rabba says, the Amar Kra, because the pasuk says, Laman yedu deresecha, in order that they shall know. In other words, your generations, your future generations shall know. Ki basukais, because in sukkos, in tents, hoishavti es bnei Yisrael, I placed or let reside the Jewish people. So that is the pasuk. The pasuk is in Parshas Emor. It says, in order that the generations will know, future generations will know that I had the Jewish people reside in Sukkos. And ad esrim ama adam yodeya shu dar b'sukkah, until 20 amos, a person knows that he dwells in a sukkah. L'mayla me'asr mama ein adam yodeya shu dar b'sukkah. Above 20 amos, a person does not know that he dwells in a sukkah. Mishum delay shalta ba'ena, because his eye does not dwell upon the schach. It's too high up. It doesn't catch sight. His eye doesn't see the schach. It's so high up. It's 40 feet high, between 30 and 40 feet high or more. And therefore, you don't see it. And that's why it's not going to be a kosher sukkah. And you would need to lower your roof. You lower the schach in order to make it a kosher sukkah. And so the point that we're seeing in this Gemara's answer, Rabba's answer, this answer that Rabba says is similar, is basically what Ezra was saying, that you need to be able to know that you're dwelling in a sukkah. And because the schach is so high, you would not be considered that you're knowing that you're dwelling in a sukkah. Now, Rashi adds an important point here, and that is that the whole term sukkah means schach. It means this temporary roof made of types of branches, and that is why a sukkah is called a sukkah, is because of schach. And so, in other words, will you know that you're dwelling in some type of sukkah, some type of hut? Yeah, you would know that if you're dwelling in a sukkah that's higher than 20 amos. But you're not going to know about the roof part of it. You won't know that you're dwelling in a sukkah, which is called a sukkah because of schach. That you're not going to know. Why? Because you don't see it. You don't see the schach. And that's the important part of the sukkah, is the schach. And based on that point, we can understand Rabba's statement that he learns from the verse that you need to be able to see that you're in a sukkah with schach on it, and you don't see that if the sukkah is too high. And so, according to that, the sukkah needs to have is maxed out at 20 amos. It's interesting that the term used for good vision is 20/20. That's interesting. That the law of sukkah is 20 amos is the max that we say you will see that you see up to 20 amos. But if it's above that, then if it's the Maila Me'asr Mama, then it's already not kosher. But you see up to 20. I don't know what that term 20/20 vision is, but maybe it's connected to a certain distance of 20 feet or 20. No. Okay. Anyway, that's the first answer that the Gemara gives. Reb Zera Amar Mehacha. Reb Zera says that we know the law of 20 amos from here. The pasuk says, "V'sukkah tia letzel yoimam mechayriv," that the sukkah will be for shade, sail, yoimam in the day, mechayriv from the heat. So, in other words, the goal of the sukkah is to be shady. That's the goal. That's why we dwell in a sukkah, or the meaning of the sukkah is that it has shade. Ad esrim ama adam yoshev sel sukkah. Till 20 amas, a person dwells in the shade of a sukkah. L'mayla me'esrim ama ein adam yoshev b'tzel sukkah el b'tzel defanis. Above 20 amas, person does not dwell in the shade of a sukkah. Instead, he dwells in the shade of the walls, because the schach, the roof of the sukkah, is so high, and therefore the roof doesn't really give so much of the shade, but the walls of the sukkah, they are basically giving the shade. The reason why you feel you're dwelling in shade is because the walls are blocking the sun, and they're so high up, and the shade is really shade of the walls, and not the shade of the schach. So the schach is not really doing anything, and therefore up to 20 amas, the shade could be potential. The schach, the roof, is potentially giving you shade, but above 20 amas, the roof is not giving you shade. It's really the walls that are giving you shade. Now, that's the simple reading of the Gemara. This is Reb Zera's statement. Again, we had Rabbah said about you have to know you're dwelling in a sukkah. And Reb Zera is saying you need to dwell in shade of the schach. And here you're dwelling in shade of the walls. The schach shade is not really doing much. It's the walls that are giving you so much shade when it's so tall. And therefore, this is not considered a kosher sukkah. And Rashi adds this idea that there's no benefit of the schach. The schach is not benefiting you. You don't need the schach. Now, the Gemara is bothered with a question, and that is that you need to have the shade from the sukkah. What happens if you live in Manhattan, where you have all these tall buildings? What happens if you live in a place where there's mountains, and you're two mountains, right? And you're in the valley, you have the sukkah. So you're not getting any shade from your schach. Your shade is coming from the mountains are blocking the sun, or the big buildings are blocking the sun. So in that case, are you going to say that the sukkah is not kosher? You said that a sukkah that's 20 amas high is not kosher. So maybe a sukkah that's made in between two big mountains, inside the valley, in between two big mountains, should also not be kosher. So the Gemara asks, Amar le Abaye here, Amar le Abaye elameyata, if that's so, if a person builds his sukkah bi'ashtaros karnayim, in a place called Ashtaros Karnayim, it's basically a valley that has two mountains on the two sides of this valley, and the sun does not shine into the valley. Hachinami delay habi sukkah. You're going to say over there also that's not considered a kosher sukkah. It's invalid. What do you do if that's where you live? If that's where you're able to build it? That you're going to say it's not a kosher sukkah? It's because there's some mountains and other things around it. So the Gemara answers Amar Le. So Reb Zera answered to Abaye, Hasam over there, Dal Ashtaros Karnayim. If you remove the mountains of Ashtaros Karnayim that surround the valley, or that are on the two sides of the valley, Ika Tzel Sukkah, you will have shade of Sukkah. But Hacha here, in the case of a Sukkah that's very tall, Dal Defanos, if you remove the wall, so you don't have the the walls that are giving the shade, leka sel sukkah, you will not have sale of sukkah. You won't have the shade that would come from the schach. You won't have that, and therefore this will not be a kosher sukkah. And Rashi adds in that the sun will come from below, and it won't be called a sukkah anymore. You won't have a kosher sukkah. It's not called a sukkah, and therefore the sukkah needs to potentially have schach that will give shade, and that works in a valley. The sukkah potentially could give shade. It doesn't happen to because of some side problem. But here, the sukkah itself can't give shade because the walls are way too tall, and because the wall it's so high up, it's not causing there. It's not giving shade. It really is the shade of the walls. The schach is not giving the shade. There's no benefit from the schach walls, and therefore the schach sukkah, the roof, and therefore it is considered a non-kosher sukkah. This idea that we're seeing in Reb Zera's, the view of Reb Zera, really has to do with the fact that not always is every law in the Torah clearly the way it says it, or the way the simple understanding that it has to give shade, because you could have a day that's not sunny, but what happens at night? Is the schach giving you shade? There's no, there's no light out. There's no heat. There's no, But the point is that there are laws in the Torah that are applicable, or that the understanding of it is that it has to be in potential, that it potentially is giving you shade, even though you're going to dwell in it at a day that's not hot, day that the sun's not out, a time that the sun's not out, but nevertheless, it's a sukkah that potentially would give shade if it would be daytime, if the sun would be out, it'd be daytime, so therefore it's a kosher sukkah. But it has to be potentially capable of accomplishing its mission. So in other words, there's laws in the Torah that the emphasis is the potential and not the actual. Not that it's actually causing you shade, but it's potential. It's a sukkah that could give shade. It's in other words, it's a law, not in the shade. It's a law in the sukkah. It has to be a sukkah of shade. It's a difference of how you understand the law. It's not that you have to dwell in shade. You have to be in a sukkah a sukkah that gives shade. Now it's not giving shade, okay, but it's a sukkah that gives shade. And if the sun would be out, it would give shade. If there would be mountains around me, it would give shade. That's good. That's the sukkah. But here, the sukkah itself is not a sukkah that gives shade, and therefore, according to Reb Zera, that would be a reason why above 20 amos is not going to be a kosher sukkah. Okay, now we have Rava. So we had Rabba, Reb Zera, now Rava. Rava Amar Mehacha. Rava says from here. Rava has an interesting logic. Rava says, Basukkah is Teshu Shivas Yamim. Sukkah, you shall dwell for 7 days. Amra Torah, the Torah tells us, Kol Shivas Hayamim Tzei Midivras Keva. All 7 days you have to leave your dwelling that is established, that is permanent. V'sheiv, and dwell, B'diras Arai, in a dira, in a dwelling that's temporary. And that's what you need to do for Sukkot. You need to dwell in a temporary dwelling. Ad esrim ama, until 20 amas. Adam oisa dirasi diras arai. Until 20 amas, a person makes their dwelling a temporary dwelling, because until 20 amas, you could build something and it'll stand. It'll be safe. Lamaila me'asrim ama, if you build something above 20 amas, needs to be permanent, because you need to solidify it, you need to strengthen it, because if you don't, above 20 amas is too big for a temporary dwelling to be safe. So therefore, above 20 amas, ein adam ma'isa dirasi diras arai, a person would not make his dwelling a temporary dwelling, Ela diras keva, he would make it a permanent dwelling, and therefore it would not be a kosher sukkah. In other words, this sukkah needs to be permanent because you're making it so tall. You're going to need to strengthen it or tie it down. Because of the height of it, it will it won't be able to stand. It will topple over if it's not tied down in a more permanent way. So this sukkah would be a permanent sukkah, and that is not the purpose of sukkah. Sukkah is meant to be a temporary dwelling, not a permanent dwelling. The Gemara then asks, Samar le Abaye, here again, Abaye asks a question on Rava, Elamayata. If so, then also Machitza Shal Barzel, what happens if you made a sukkah with iron, Vesikech al Gabon, and you put schach on top of them, on top of the iron beam? Hachinami delay habi sukkah. Are you going to say also that it's not considered a kosher sukkah because you made it permanent? The Gemara answers a similar idea. Amar le hachikam minalach. Rava answers, this is what I meant to say. Adesrim ama the other maisa dirase diras arai. Until 20 amas, a person makes his dwelling a temporary dwelling. Ki avid le diras keva nami nafik. If you made it permanent, you fulfilled your mitzvah. You also accomplish your mitzvah, even though you made it permanent because you made it in a size that's a temporary size. The Mailam Yasrum Amma, but if you make your sukkah above 20 amas, the other Maisa Dirasi Diras Keva, that size needs to be made in a permanent dwelling. If you make it temporary, even if you make it temporary, it will not be a mitzvah that you will fulfill your obligation. You will not be nafik, means to go out and fulfill your loy nafik. You have not fulfilled your obligation by doing such a sukkah, because the size of your sukkah is called a size of diras keva, of a permanent dwelling. And the Torah wants us to make the sukkah in a way that is a temporary dwelling. What does that basically mean? It means you could make it permanent, but it has to be a size that's a temporary size, and that with temporary size has to be below 20 amas. Anything above 20 amas is a permanent size. Below 20 amas would be a temporary size, and that's what the Torah is obligating us. Okay, we will continue Metz Hashem tomorrow. Sei gesund, everyone. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you very much, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.